Good morning. Today we're going to be discussing the Montana and Wyoming Plant Materials Program. We're going to give a brief history of the program and then discuss what the program currently offers and how that plant materials information is incorporated into conservation planning. And finally, we'll discuss what technical resources are available and where you can locate them. As you know, the NRCS got its start as the Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s. The SCS then created the Division of Nurseries in 1935, which is known today as the NRCS Plant Materials Program. In the 1930s, there was a need for plant materials for use on farms due to the widespread erosion problems caused by the Dust Bowl. But at the time, there were few commercial outlets for plant materials available, but there was a great need for nursery stock of conifers and hardwoods, shrubs, and grasses. So the SCS acquired some seed from federal, state, and commercial nurseries, but they also undertook a massive collection effort of native seed for nursery stock production and direct planting. And by 1939, the nurseries in the service had the capacity to produce between 150 and 200 million trees and shrubs annually. In the early 1950s, there was a shift then from nurseries, which produced plants in large volumes, to plant material centers, or PMCs, which perform the task of testing and selecting plant species. The centers began studies on native and exotic plants to determine what their adaptations were and their characteristics. For example, they were looking at their growth habits, their soil binding properties, their drought tolerance, and also looking at how easy they were to propagate and their potential usefulness for soil and water conservation. After a plant evaluation, plant release occurs, and the foundation seed of that plant release is then provided to commercial seed growers for production and sale to the public. And in this manner, there's no competition with government entities. The mission of the Plant Materials Program has always been to find plant solutions to solve conservation problems. Plant material centers around the United States have developed over 600 conservation plant releases of grasses, legumes, forbs, shrubs, and trees. Finding these uniquely evolved plants to meet specific conservation needs has been, and it continues to be, the focus of the Plant Materials Program. So these plants that have been released literally provide protection for millions of acres across our nation. There are currently 25 USDA NRCS plant material centers, and their location and service area are shown on this map. Each center is based in an ecologically distinct area to evaluate plants and vegetation technologies that support the conservation programs and practices that are offered locally, regionally, and at national scales. The Bridger Plant Materials Center is part of the Northwest region of PMCs, which works collaboratively on projects to address regional resource concerns, such as identifying plants for saline soils or selecting cover crop species, or looking at grazing land restoration, or maybe even habitat, wildlife habitat improvements. A recent example of a regional product is our technical notes on, this one's on cover crop seed vendors for the Western United States. And we've also recently produced a pollinator plant species tech note for the Intermountain West. The 130-acre Bridger Plant Materials Center is located in Bridger, Montana, and it was established in 1959. The land is owned by the Soil and Water Conservation District of Montana and Wyoming, and then the NRCS leases the land. The Bridger Plant Materials Center was established and operated in cooperation with the University of Wyoming and the Montana State University Ag Experimental Stations. And the center was located centrally between the two states. And the location was also chosen because it has deep alluvial soils, it has dependable irrigation water, it has a low incidence of hail, and a relatively long growing season. It's also in close proximity to very droughty sites and also high elevation sites. And all of these characteristics make it a good place for testing plant species for release. What the plant material program does is driven by our needs assessment that identifies activities at national, regional, state, and local levels. The needs assessment is developed by the plant material committees of Montana and Wyoming, which meets annually. These committees are made up of area agronomists, rangeland management specialists, state specialists, and more. And they help us identify plant-specific requests and concerns, resource concerns for the states of Montana and Wyoming, and so that we can address specific plant-related resource concerns for our service area. And what we work on in plant materials and plant technologies can then be incorporated into the field office technical guide, or FOTOG, to help guide conservation planning in our area. An early focus of the PMC was on collecting, testing, and releasing conservation plant materials. But in recent years, it's also included plant establishment research. Rangeland health has been a priority resource concern for many areas, or for many years, but we're also very involved in other conservation areas. For example, recently we've been working a lot on pollinator plant establishment and how to promote and improve soil health through the use of cover crops. The PMC also has a long history in mineland reclamation, native plant community restoration, and the revegetation of salt-affected sites. Once a plant is released from the center, it is that releasing PMC's responsibility to maintain the foundation seed for commercial growers in perpetuity, or until that plant release is no longer in demand. With all of the work we do, we aim to transfer information through publications like our technical notes and plant guides, and we incorporate plant materials information into employee trainings, field planting demonstrations, and other education projects. But ultimately, what we want is for our work to be incorporated into conservation practices and put into practice by the NRCS field offices to improve conservation. So on the next several slides, we're going to give you a few examples of our recent work in these topic areas and how we incorporate that information into conservation planning. And after that, we're going to focus a little more on where you can find that information. The search for a species for conservation release or species selection is usually driven by a specific conservation need. However, there's a lot of different considerations that need to be taken into account. For example, for a conservation need, we might be looking for a forb species that is broadly adapted for east of the Continental Divide. That plant needs to be able to establish readily and be predictable in its establishment. It might need to provide habitat and forage for pollinators, and it also needs to be affordable to the landowner. Considerations for the seed industry also need to be considered. And in this plant, they may be looking for a plant that produces a lot of seed. It also needs to be easily harvested and have low seed shatter. So it needs to be able to have a height that's tall enough for commercial seed harvesting equipment to harvest that seed. And these are real world considerations that need to be taken into account, because if a plant doesn't lend itself to easy harvest by commercial production, it's never going to become available on the commercial market, or if it does, it's going to be too expensive. For species that might be used in restoration of habitats to their original state, Matching the local genetics may also be an important consideration for plant selection. And this is the case with the National Park Service projects we've worked on. So at the confluence of all these different traits will be a good species to consider for plant selection, development, and release. And the photo on the right here is of Blazing Star, which is in the beginning stages of plant selection at the PMC. After choosing a species to work with, there are many years of evaluation and research that have to happen before a plant is released to commercial production. So it might be 5 to 15 years of studying this plant. Evaluations of that plant is going to look at specific traits, such as how much biomass it produces, its height. It might look at flower production or other traits depending on what the targeted conservation need is. The species research is also going to include how to establish that species and establishment recommendations, such as what is the seeding rate it needs to be planted at, seeding depth that should be used, what is the timing of season of planting that will readily establish plants. The end result for the conservation user then is the release of a species that has desired traits to address a resource concern, but also that we provide recommendations for how to get that species established. And this information is then incorporated into our technical notes and our seed calculators and conservation practices and plant guides and more. This table here is an example of a technical note on the conservation seed species for Montana and Wyoming. And it's also incorporated into our seed calculators. So when you choose a species, you want to look for a proven selection that has been developed and that we know is suitable for Montana and Wyoming. And then follow recommendations that we have for what the seeding timing is, or the depth of seeding that is needed, or the salinity tolerance and the seeding rate. But our ultimate goal with this information, with the plant selection information and the research, is to provide a better adapted species and better performing plant, and then to also help improve your seeding results. The Plant Material Center's recent work with pollinator plants is focused on identifying species that establish well and that persist. So several of our recent studies in field plantings have used alternate row seeding techniques, where you have one life form seeded in one row and another life form in another row, in order to determine if it helps improve the establishment of both forbs and grasses in the pollinator planting. In another study, we're looking at grass and forb mixes and looking at the proportion of the grass in those mixes to determine if it affects the establishment of forb species. Each of our studies in field plantings then have final reports that highlight the conservation applications. But one of the best ways to get the information to field application is not necessarily to go to the reports, but to look at where it's incorporated into tech notes, seed calculators, standards and specs, and even some of our program requirements. Many of these things are going to be happening behind the scenes for conservation. For example, a conservation practice standard might direct planners to follow a specific tech note. The plant material study results are then incorporated into that tech note. For example, this is an example of a pollinator planting table, and it identifies species that we know are commercially available, and it puts an asterisk by species that we know consistently establish well in our field trials. And our hope is that it will help field offices select appropriate species and have more success with your seeding results. In recent years, we've had a lot of focus on cover crop species for improving soil health. Many of these studies have been done as a collaborative effort with Montana area staff. Cover crops are becoming more widely used and incorporated into our farming systems to improve soil health, but there's still a lot of information we need to learn. So studies at the PMC have focused on testing species and cultivars, looking at optimizing seeding rates, looking at seed mixes and seeing how individual species respond in those seed mixes, and looking at plant yields for cover crops. One of our recent studies that we completed evaluated 58 different commercially available cool season cultivars and varieties of 8 common annual species for their adaptation in Montana and Wyoming. In this study, we looked at how well each of these cultivars established, how much biomass they produce, and we even looked at the forage quality of all of the cultivars. With the results of this, then we can help inform field offices and landowners on the species and cultivars that might address their land use objectives. For example, in the first row of this photo, you can see that there's different varieties of Austrian winter pea. And you can just visually see that there's varying amounts of biomass produced per cultivar. So for a landowner who's interested in biomass production for erosion control or for forage production, we can help direct them to a suitable cultivar for their needs. The results then of our cover crop studies are then incorporated into practices, standards and specs, cover crop seed calculators, and our tech notes. In our tech notes, at the end of them, we provide a concise summary. We try to have bullet points in that area of just what the take-home messages are of the study and how that can be applied in the field. For example, this is a table from our national cover crop study, and in that we provide a summary of each species and how well it did and what resource concern they're going to address. And then we have this summary table that provides information on how much biomass each cultivar produced, their height, and their nutritional value. And we also color-coded the table with recommendations for each cultivar. So our hope is that it helps direct users to select the most appropriate and best performing species and cultivars for our region. Many of you are familiar with the saline soils throughout Montana and Wyoming because they can physically and chemically impact plant growth. Many plant species are going to be tolerant to soil salinity, and other plants might tolerate, some plants are not tolerant of soil salinity, and other plants may tolerate salinity at low levels, and some may experience a toxic effect at high levels of salinity. The Bridger Plant Materials Center has had a long history of identifying species that tolerate saline sites. The selection of these species at the PMC has led to improved commercial availability of species and diversity of species, and ultimately the performance of species on salt-affected sites. So Bridger grass releases that are tolerant and perform well on salt-affected sites include Pryor slender wheatgrass, Shoshone many-stem wild rye, Rosanna western wheatgrass, and Garrison creeping foxtail. One of the results of all of this work has been this go-to reference table for salinity tolerance of plants that are adapted to Montana and Wyoming. This is included in our Tech Note 26 that's titled Plants for Saline and Alkaline Soils. And what's particularly valuable about this chart is that the yellow line is showing where a plant is going to be measurably impacted by a saline soils, where the purple line or the red line is going to indicate where plant mortality is going to occur. So it'll help select species that are suitable for the range of salinity levels on a site. As a result of the years of research, the PMC has also developed these technical notes for addressing salt-affected sites. And they're written to give a planter an understanding of a saline condition, and then to select plant species that are going to be able to not only tolerate, but also thrive with the conditions of the site. Maintaining foundation seed for commercial seed growers to then establish fields of seed for retail sale is also a large part of every Plant Material Center program. And it's especially true for the Bridger PMC, since we maintain 32 species releases. The seed is provided to foundation seed entities at the University of Wyoming and Montana State University, and then it's distributed to commercial seed growers across the Northwest and Northern Great Plains. Maintaining a steady seed supply, making sure it's equitably allotted, regardless of market demand, helps ensure that commercial growers can quickly increase supplies should there be a demand. For example, a severe wildfire season or increased demand from the Conservation Reserve Program that puts particular species in demand. The seed harvest at the Bridger PMC then for foundation seed really keeps our staff busy, and it extends from mid-June when they're harvesting bluegrass until late December when they're collecting seed of Rocky Mountain juniper. As I mentioned before, the Plant Material Centers have released over 600 conservation plant selections of grasses, legumes, forbs, shrubs, and trees. And these releases really represent the vast majority of what's going to be readily available and economical as far as seed sources on the market for conservation application. When purchasing certified seed from a vendor, there's an assurance then that the seed is going to be high quality and it's going to maintain the characteristics for which the plant release was selected. So in this example, the foundation seed of Critana thickspike wheatgrass is supplied by the Bridger Plant Material Center, and Bannock thickspike wheatgrass is supplied by the Idaho Plant Material Center to this commercial market and this vendor for growing and for sale. Similarly, foundation seed from the tree and shrub releases, which are maintained in seed orchards at the PMC, are supplied directly to the Montana Conservation Seedling Nursery. So when you purchase live plants from the nursery, which is usually purchased through the Conservation District when you're putting in windbreaks and shelter belts, you're receiving the first generation plants grown from the foundation seed source. The Plant Materials Program also does work with the National Park Service. The parks require that their revegetation projects use seed that's collected within park boundaries, and that's to ensure that genetic adaptation to the site is maintained. So prior to any park construction project, wildland seed is collected from the park and sent to the PMC where it's grown, and the seed is increased for use back at the park for their reclamation projects. This is a collaboration that's been going on for over 30 years. And in these photos, you can see a couple of different species that are being grown for them. On the left is slender wheatgrass, and on the right is Great Basin wild rye. Not all of what happens at the Plant Materials Program occurs at the Plant Materials Center. There's other activities and opportunities, such as demonstration gardens of conservation species that can be used for education and training purposes. All of these demonstration gardens usually have plant labels, including what the common name is, the Latin name, and the variety of each plant. And these photos are just a few examples of our demonstration gardens. So in the upper right is the Pollinator demonstration garden at the PMC. And the two diagonal pictures here are from the Terry Field Office demonstration planting in Terry, Montana. And on the bottom left is a picture of the Gallatin County Conservation District Pollinator Garden, where we've supplied plants and designed seed mixes for landowners who are interested in developing their own pollinator garden. Off-center field plantings are another important part of our work. So field plantings are a collaboration with the field office and area office staff, sometimes other agencies. They can be simple demonstration projects, or they can be designed as a research project. But on all of our field plantings, we conduct evaluations to determine the success of all the species involved. The field planting purpose is to assess the conservation potential of a new plant selection or a mix of species, or test a new technology, and to do it using actual conditions and a variety of different soil, climate, and land uses. So for a conservation planner, a field planting might be a good way to test a new species that you haven't used before in your service area. And for a producer, a field planting can be a good way to test plants or technology on a small scale before you invest in a large scale planting. With all of the information we gain from the field plantings, we use it to support our plant releases and provide guidance on those plants through photog and other, and we can use these sites also as an educational demonstration site. This is a map of some of the field planting locations in Montana and Wyoming. These represent both new and existing field plantings that were evaluated between 2017 and 2019. So you can see that we try to pick diverse areas to test species. Field offices, area offices, or state office staff can all initiate a field planting. And the first step in a field planting is to develop a planting plan, which is usually developed by the field office in cooperation with a landowner who's interested in participating. The field office then submits the plan to the Plant Materials Committee, and the committee reviews it, provides any suggestions, and then approves the plan. And then we can get into the specifics of where we're going to acquire the seed and where we're going to get the planting equipment to put in the field planting. It's the landowner's responsibility then to prepare the site for planting, including doing the weed control. And this is a really important part of the field planting because a poorly prepared site usually results in poor seeding results. After it's installed, then the field planting is maintained and evaluated for 10 years. And this is a really important point because the landowner is responsible for the long-term maintenance of the site. But it's really important to maintain it and evaluate it for this long because it gives us information not only on how well a species establishes, but on how well it's going to persist on the site, especially with different weather patterns over the years. And finally, with that information that we gain from the project, we transfer that results through our field planting reports. Okay, we've mentioned a couple times that the ultimate goal of the plant materials program is to provide information and technologies to field offices and to have this plant materials information incorporated into conservation practice application. So let's switch gears now and discuss where you can find our plant materials information. And one of the first places you're going to find the plant materials information is incorporated into standards and specifications in the field office technical guide. Our tech notes are referenced in documents and often have links to the materials. And plant materials information is also incorporated into the practices themselves. For example, if you see in a practice that there's recommended seeding dates, or seeding methods, or seeding rates, those all come from the research that's done at the plant materials centers. Another place you're going to find information in photog is in section 1, particularly in the Wyoming photog, it's going to list our technical notes in that area. The perennial seed calculators and the cover crop seed calculators are also found in ePhotog, and they're stored under the relevant conservation practices. So these calculators incorporate years of research from many plant material sources into one tool that can be used to create a seed mix. So as you're designing a seed mix, it pulls information on the recommended seed rate, the number of seeds per pound, and auto-calculates the seed needs for your project. We're currently updating these tools now so that you can also use the data tab in the spreadsheet to reference information on a species' precipitation range, the suitable soil types for a species, its salinity tolerance, bloom period, and more. And in the cover crop calculator, the data tab is providing information on the resource concern that each species addresses. So our hope is that this can be kind of a one-stop shop where you have many years of resources incorporated into one tool. Okay, so the Plant Materials Program of Montana and Wyoming has over 200 documents to help assist you in plant materials related conservation. Some of these are found in Photog, like I mentioned, but the majority of them are going to be accessed through the Montana and Wyoming Plant Materials Program homepage. So whether you're on the NRCS Wyoming webpage or NRCS Montana webpage, if you navigate to the Plant Materials Program, it's going to bring you to the central location. So you're going to be seeing this website. And on the left-hand side, you're going to find quick links to our tech notes, to our forums, to the Bridger PMC TV site, and our field planting reports. When you go to the tech notes webpage, you're going to find a list of our most popular and recent publications where you can download a PDF document. However, we have many, many more publications. And so what we've done is at the top of the web page, you'll find a link to a PDF titled Publications Available from the Plant Materials Center. And if you download this document, it'll open a PDF. There'll be approximately 200 different plant material references there. You can search the PDF then for a topic or a technical note number. And each of those materials is going to have a link to the actual document that'll open in its separate PDF. If you want to access our study reports or newsletters or journal articles, those are going to be available on the National Montana Wyoming Plant Materials Center webpage, and there's also a link to that on the Tech Notes webpage. Okay, from the Plant Materials homepage, you can also access our Field Planting Reports website. And on the site, you're going to find a list by topic of field planting results. So there's going to be topics on pollinators, range plantings, pasture plantings, windbreak plantings, where you can download a short summary of each project and the results. And when you open these two-page handouts, it's going to give you information on what was done, what the site was like, how the site was prepped, when it was planted, and what the seed mix is. This information then can be used as a handout for cooperators or for field tours or to share with other staff. But basically it's the information to share what our results are to a wider audience. Okay, from the homepage again, the Plant Materials Program homepage, if you go to the Bridger PMC TV website, you're going to see links to our videos, our webinars and our videos, including this webinar series. You're also going to find short videos on different conservation plants and farm equipment and farm management. Another place you can find plant materials information is on the USDA Plants database website. So when you do a search for a species, it'll open the species website. So this is an example of Western wheatgrass. And at the bottom left column, you're going to see links for a fact sheet and a plant guide. So if you open the plant guide, it's going to have a lot of information for you on a species description, where it's distributed in its range, the soil types it's suited for, how to establish it in the field or even in a farm setting. You're going to find information on that species management. For many species, there'll be information on the forage quality of that plant and also what cultivars are available through commercial suppliers. And finally, we disseminate information to our field offices through field days at the PMC, field tours, trainings, meeting presentations, and more. But if you're ever having trouble finding information, please just ask one of us in the Montana-Wyoming Plant Materials Program, and we're happy to direct you to where to access that information. Thank you for participating today. I appreciate it. And please look for future webinars coming up throughout the winter. Thanks.